Well, it's time for our third feature in today's episode now with our undercover French Englishman. So very well spoken, certainly better spoken English than myself, Baptiste Reynaud. And this afternoon, this evening, this morning, depending on where you are and where you're listening from, he's taking a look at another huge match on the French Ligue 1 calendar. We've been deprived of it over the last, well, probably in the 21st century more often than not. But this is a huge clash that developed at the back end of the last century, and we've had some big clashes over the years. Now that they're both back in the top flight and looking to do well, two ambitious clubs, it's back to that passionate affair it always has been. I am, of course, talking about the Derby du Nord, Lille versus Lens. It's coming up in round 8, and Baptiste has more on the match that stops the north of France.
The Derby du Nord between the sire of the Racing Club de Lens and the dog of Lille is a truly regional derby rather than national rivalry. Only 36 kilometers separates the two towns, and both teams have rarely been near the top of the table at the same time or have truly been in the French people's imaginations as compared to the likes of Marseille, Saint-Etienne, Lyon or PSG, which form some of the biggest rivalries in the country. Traditionally, Lens have always been seen as the more working class team with real grassroots and a public representative of the whole region, whilst Lille has always been seen as more bourgeois due to its status to the main big city of the north. Lens remains, even to this day, rather underappreciated as a town. It's a small town, about 32,000 in the city itself, whilst Lille is much bigger with about 250,000 people and attracts more investment. And thanks to Eurostar, has been a lot more visible with its links to the UK and Belgium and its status as a big university town. But despite that rivalry, and no matter what the local fans might say, there's actually a lot more that unites those two clubs than actually divides them. So first, the fact that the Nord, the region they're in, and the Ch'tis, the local people with the Picardy language, have traditionally been derided by the rest of the France because of their status as mining country, which will be, which people will probably see close links to certain areas of the UK, actually. Before the arrival of the Eurostar and a famous film in France called Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis, which portrayed the Ch'tis as they are loving, welcoming people, the Nord was always seen as slightly backwards, uneducated, and not worth its time. That obviously has changed since, and the fact that they have now two thriving clubs is a huge boost to the region and a huge boost to both clubs. Secondly, the two clubs have had their ups and downs over the years. Lens spent most of the 2010s in Ligue 2 and financial disarray, and whilst Lille have spent the last 20 years in Ligue 1, they have also had a few brushes with relegation and difficult financial times. Having said that, what is great at the moment about the derby is that both clubs are finally back into the ascendancy at the same time. Lille were obviously champions a couple of years ago under Christophe Galtier, and after a difficult season, they seem to be back with Paulo Fonseca at the helm since the start of last year, playing exciting football. And obviously Lens, since their return to Ligue 1, have been nothing short of sensational, finishing second last year, playing attractive football, and being back in the Champions League. But having said that, it's uncertain times at the moment at the start of the season for both Lens and Lille. Lens have suffered a number of defeats and recorded their first win only on match day 6 after worrying 3-0 defeats versus Monaco and 1 against Lens, conceding too many goals as well against the likes of PSG when that was the bedrock of their squad and their success last season. For Lille, it feels a bit as though they've stagnated. They suffered a heavy defeat away to Lorient, and they recently lost their long-term invincibility at home to Reims, who are themselves very much a thriving team. Whilst they've been unconvincing in their wins and draws, and there have been a lot of rumours about Paulo Fonseca, one of their real assets, being really dissatisfied at the club for various reasons. So there's a lot to look forward to in this derby. One which is obviously, as I said, a regional derby, and for which fans have tended to be close and good-hearted rather than tribal and antagonistic. It's a good-hearted derby that will see a lot of interesting players coming through this year, and experiencing their first Derby du Nord. So the likes of Lenny Yoro, who is a 17-year-old centre-back, really promising for Lille and starting to make headways into the team, is one to look out for. And obviously for Lens, who seem to be gaining form a little bit, we'll look out for Eli Wahi, whose signing at the summer was a real statement of intent. Probably the biggest statement of intent from a French club over the last few years as they head into the Champions League and try to regain their form. On top of that, two great up-and-coming managers, Francaise and Paulo Fonseca, both want their teams to play positive football, are tactically flexible, and have had a lot of success trying to bring through players and devise a real system and a real identity to their sides. So one of the most passionate derbies, one of the friendliest derbies, probably, if you're coming as a neutral, and certainly one to be excited about.
JJ, we often bemoan the fact that in France we don't have this notion or an English notion of a derby, or perhaps a Buenos Aires notion of a derby, where I think you've got 20 professional football clubs in one city. In France, it's generally one club per city. This is a classic example. I think Baptiste said it at the start of his report there, that it's just a number of kilometers that separate Lens and Lille. Is this as close to a derby as you can get, a real one in France? I mean, there's Saint-Etienne, there's and Lyon, there's Nice, Monaco, there's Toulouse, Bordeaux. But again, we're talking more and more kilometers, and it's the same story here in the north. But why are these considered derbies then? Is it because the regions are so strong, the identity is so strong? If they're not cross-town rivals, they're cross-region, cross-department rivals?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you still have that rivalry. In fact, it's interesting. We touched on Nantes earlier, but it was sort of a similar story with Nantes and Rennes. And you had Mathis Ablin, who sort of crossed the divide just for a loan spell with Nantes. And then you have the passionate Rennes fans holding up the banner saying it's basically a one-way ticket out of the club. There won't be any sort of return after his loan spell, which perhaps was going a little overboard, but also at the same time, it speaks to the passion that some of these fixtures can generate. And obviously, we've gone into depth many a time on this podcast about how frustrating it is to not be able to have the color and atmosphere that away fans can bring to some of these big games. I think that away fans have been banned for this one again, but I think what really helps to make this one feel like a real true derby, sort of, especially in the sense of sort of like comparing it to English football derbies, is the atmosphere that gets generated, especially when you play at Lens, which is a very English style stadium with, arguably one of the best, if not the best, atmosphere in France, certainly when it comes to, to one of these big games. And it's one of those matches that I think took on importance as well over a number of years when Lens, were representing French football on the continental stage. Lille were really coming into their own as well and becoming a bit of a domestic force. And it's two passionate sets of fans, and it always, provides, maximum entertainment, and quite often, a nice little bit of needle as well, which, I feel like, French football almost needs a bit more of, not less, in terms of how these games are policed.
Andreas, where would you classify the Derby du Nord in the ranking of French derbies and French rivalries? I mean, it's a pretty passionate one. We have seen some scenes in the last few years of the fans taking it perhaps beyond the limits necessarily, but I mean, like JJ, I love there being a little bit of needle. I love the fact that the home fan or the away fans are there at the training ground when the bus leaves to travel to the game with the flares, and on the overpasses as the away teams arriving in the next day, and there are all the signs, this is not going to go well for you, if I can put that very politely. We do not wish you the very best of luck today. Those sort of messages that are written in more colloquial, colourful French. But Andreas, where do you rank this one?
Oh, I think it's high because as a region, I think it's one of the real hotbeds of France. I mean, obviously a place like, there are cities where football is has a hugely passionate following, but I spent a bit of time up there, and really for me, that part of France is all kind of really football crazy. we should say a lot of players do come from that part of the world. If you look at French internationals, a lot of top players come from that part of the world. And it is just a part of the world where they love their football. Cynics might say because it's not the most beautiful part of France, but I would disagree with that. There's a lot of nice parts of France up there. And without getting too deeply into it, this idea of the regional identity and regions asserting themselves, it's very important. It's one of the big issues in France at the moment, Robbie, because France is a very centralized country. And at the moment, there's a big debate in French politics about regional identities and cultures being recognized more. So that might have something to do with it. But I do think it's a hotbed of French football in terms of geography. It is the closest. In France, people do sort of call everything a derby. I've heard Lyon against Marseille called a derby, and it's just a language thing. Whereas from those from an English point of view, it is a derby of a specific place. It's a big derby, and for once, both teams are doing fairly well. So it's really one to look forward to.
All right, let's keep moving on. Unless Baptiste, do you have anything more to add to what we can expect from the Derby du Nord in a week's time?
As just echoing what people have said, just a really passionate derby, but also one that I think really reflects the values of the region. The people are very humble there. They really support their football club because it means a lot to them. It's very close to their heart. Whilst in other regions, it's more around hot-headedness, I would put it. In certainly in the south, if you were to jump into maybe French cliches, but it's this is as close as you're going to get to a British derby, I think. In Ligue 1, around the south, it would be more Italian style of attitude, I would say, in the stands, and Brittany has its own culture as well, but it doesn't have that same closeness and proximity with Ligue as the Derby du Nord has. So it's certainly a very unique one and a very exciting one. And I'm glad both teams are doing well at the same time, because it's also a region that needs a lot of spotlight on it and deserves more spotlight on it.
It's the beer derby of France. That's basically what you're saying. You can have all different regions and cider in the west and down south, maybe a bit of Campari or all your aperitifs, but the Derby du Nord is the beer derby of France. And I agree with you, Baptiste, if that is indeed what you were trying to say, because I think it is as well. You're listening to Baptiste Reynaud and Jonathan Johnson and Andreas Evagora talking all things French football.